right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shannon Pearson. I am the Public Interest Cybersecurity Fellow at UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, also known as CLTC. CLTC is the sponsor of today's launch event for Citizen Lab's new paper, Enhancing Cybersecurity and Resilience for Transnational Dissidents. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today, which is also brought to you by Citizen Lab. So I will turn things over to Anne Cleveland, who is the Executive Director of CLTC. Anne, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I am Anne Cleveland, the Executive Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. We're a research center at the University of California, Berkeley, dedicated to looking over the horizon at the future of cybersecurity and expanding who participates in and who has access to cybersecurity. I invite you all to check out all of our work at cltc.berkeley.edu, including our public interest cybersecurity program that is sponsoring this webinar. Public interest cybersecurity seeks to ensure that all communities that rely on technology for public life receive cybersecurity protection. And the project today, Citizens Lab's project, and the research that you'll hear about is emblematic of that public interest cybersecurity mission. It was actually part of our first ever public interest cybersecurity research call for papers, with the objective to increase the scientific body of knowledge about cybersecurity for communities and organizations that often fall through the cracks of cyber defense. These are sometimes called target-rich, resource-poor organizations, or organizations that are, quote unquote, below the cyber poverty line. These organizations include critical organizations in our communities, like nonprofits, state and local governments, small utilities, hospitals, school districts, and relevant to today's conversation, people like activists and journalists. So the working papers from our call for papers were presented last June at our 2024 Cyber Civil Defense Summit, and they are now on deck to be published as CLTC white papers. So stay tuned for more about that throughout the course of the webinar. But in the meantime, it is my true honor to introduce our moderator, Ron Deibert. He probably needs no introduction, but Ron is a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and the director of Citizen Lab. Ron, thank you so much for moderating this discussion this morning, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thanks to everybody at CLTC Berkeley for making this happen. I'm not going to take up a lot of time myself, other than to introduce these two amazing people, Noura Aljizawi and Nicola Lawford, who worked for actually a number of years on the project that is being published today. They spearheaded this project along with a number of other people at the Citizen Lab. And I'm just going to turn it over to them so that they can present the fruits of their work over the last few years. So over to Nicola and Noura. And by the way, once they're done, I'll be moderating questions from all of you.
Thank you, Shannon, Anne, and Ron. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. We are really excited to share the findings of our research and get your feedback and answer any questions that you have. This report examines the cybersecurity landscapes, vulnerability and resilience of exiled women dissidents in the United States, and sheds lights on the gaps in existing cybersecurity frameworks. As Ron mentioned, this report is part of a forthcoming big report by Citizen Lab on gender dimensions of digital transnational repression on a global scale. So briefly, in this white paper, we explore the cybersecurity challenges that transnational activists, organization face and grassroots activists and dissidents face specific risks faced by women activists in exile and how they respond, and what can be done to enhance their cyber resilience. Digital transnational repression simply is a phenomenon that arises when exiled dissidents are targeted digitally by authoritarian regimes. Authorities mean authorities of their country of origin. Transnational activists, particularly exiled women dissidents, are crucial voices in global human rights advocacy. Unfortunately, their activism makes them targets of state-backed sophisticated cyber threats. These attacks are not just technical or digital, they are often paired with offline attacks such as harassment, intimidation, targeting of family members in their home country or even in exile. Interpol reports, notice, among many other tactics. I really encourage everyone interested in this in checking out the perfect report by our colleagues at Freedom House on transnational repression. Unfortunately, when women are the targets, the attacks are deeply gendered and exploit the vulnerabilities at the intersection of gender, politics, and home country-backed digital repression. When it comes to the literature, there are certain gaps in the literature that we hope that we could start filling through this research. The literature highlights often how under-resourced organizations such as local governments and activists face cybersecurity challenges in comparison to corporate sector, making them at greater risk. Support for politically vulnerable organizations is often limited to emergency responses without aiding long-term infrastructure resilience. And there is a significant gap in studying state-sponsored digital threats targeting exiled activists. Nicola.
Thank you, Noura, and thank you everyone for joining. So cybersecurity frameworks have been developed to assist organizations in improving their security posture, including MITRE ATT&CK, the cybersecurity framework developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the US, and the international standard ISO 27001. But these are difficult to operationalize even in enterprise, and then nonprofits lag behind enterprise. And the frameworks assume an organizational structure that isn't always applicable to a grassroots organization, especially certification-based frameworks like the International Standard 27001 don't work well for under-resourced organizations because they just can't meet all of the requirements, and the frameworks miss considerations of gender and migration that affect the vulnerable groups that we've studied. A more applicable framework is called SafeTag, the Security Auditing Framework and Evaluation Template for Advocacy Groups. This is a risk and capacity-based framework with 18 audit methods and subtasks. And although it isn't tailored to the case of digital transnational repression or a gender lens, we borrowed its useful methods in our analysis. And Noura will explain.
So for our core methods, we conducted 17 semi-structured interviews with exiled dissidents women who are based in the United States. They self-reported that they were targeted digitally by what they believe to be authorities of their country of origin. We also conducted 5 interviews with 5 staff members of digital rights organizations assisting exiled dissidents to gain their insights into cyber threats and effective countermeasures they recommend. We developed also and used a framework combining SafeTag methods with the new themes from the interviews with digital rights organizations personnel as a framework to analyze our interviews and data. Nicola will dig more in the technical findings.
So despite being under-resourced and heavily targeted, activists still employ advanced security measures, both technical and policy. They'll use Apple's lockdown mode, privacy features such as VPN, end-to-end encryption, antivirus, and more advanced things like air-gapping sensitive data offline. They also had their own cybersecurity policies out of necessity, and these were integrated into their daily personal lives, such as limiting contact with people with their friends and family, with people in their country of origin, limiting the ways they share their location and home, and even conducting their own forensics and analysis of where they think cyber threats might be coming from. And Noura will continue our findings.
Exile, unlike the misassumption, doesn't mean necessarily that transnational advocates can carry on their advocacy safely. Technology continues to facilitate the home country's repression threats and threats, which is range from sophisticated digital threats like spyware, malware, phishing, to doxing, disinformation, smear campaigns, among others. One of the interviewees described the state of insecurity in exile perfectly, saying to migrate is to exchange the problem for another problem. There are also other challenges they reported speaking to us with the law enforcement. Although many of them reported attacks to law enforcement, responses are often insufficient. Some refrain from involving with authorities due to many reasons, including mistrust, especially in communities subjected to over-policing or past state repression. One of the participants shared with us her concerns, and she said, "I don't trust the police. I don't believe in their ways of dealing with people. I don't think I would ever use the mechanisms of state to protect myself." Gender and marginalized race as very important and crucial factors in making these participants and exiled women activists more vulnerable to digital threats coming from state actors. For instance, gender identities and gender-based harassment is rampant. Women dissidents are frequently the target of disinformation, often designed to discredit them based on their gender identity. For instance, one of the activists we talked to said there was a page on Facebook with a fake video of me, nude with my face on the body of the woman in the video. Also, other aspects of these women's identities are being weaponized to attack and intimidate them. One of the participants we talked to, who's a mom, she shared with us how, including there was a wave of attacks on her online and offline, but what hurt her the most was when her children were used in these campaigns digitally. She said, "They named my kids and they were watching my kids. They called me telling me that my kid was on his way to kindergarten."
So based on our findings, we have some recommendations. Activists need more long-term cybersecurity resources, and specifically current funding for activists tends to focus on short-term projects with catchy outcomes rather than the real sustained support that's going to support real resiliency. US government agencies should provide more comprehensive support in investigating, mitigating, and preventing transnational repression and following up with targets. Importantly, any interventions should be grounded in human rights and done in partnership with impacted communities to avoid additional policing and surveillance. And for tech companies, it's essential to enhance trust and safety measures for high-risk users. Device manufacturers should develop protective settings like Apple's lockdown mode to safeguard users from state-sponsored attacks. And network providers, software manufacturers, and social media platforms, all tech companies in the pipeline should invest in forensic tools to capture evidence of where cyber attacks are coming from and avoid sharing data with entities that are linked to oppressive regimes and could communicate that data to them. Social media platforms should enhance trust and safety measures that are context sensitive to regions and languages and provide public accountability tools such as API access to help users and researchers track online threats. Platforms should continue to offer privacy features like blocking multiple accounts and developing clear policies against disinformation targeting activists, journalists, and academics, applying these rules fairly across all users and languages, not just the biggest revenue generating cases. And finally, all companies should design with women and marginalized communities, as all engineers should, to ensure that their needs are integrated into all products from the start. And now Noura will conclude.
Yeah, in conclusion, the cybersecurity challenges faced by transnational women activists are urgent and demand immediate attention. These women are often isolated, under-resourced, and uniquely vulnerable to digital threats. Addressing these challenges is critical not only for their own safety, but for the continued fight for democracy and human rights. We encourage everyone here to be part of the cause and join the movement to engage with the issue and fight with us and with all these brave women and activists in exile to enhance cybersecurity for all activists in exile and in their home countries. And thank you so much for your time and participation. Please do read the white paper. If you have any questions, do ask now. If you want to ask any questions or discuss any other concerns, feel free to reach out to us. And we would love to continue this discussion in the future. Thank you.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Nicola and Noura, for that excellent overview of this important research. As is mentioned in the chat, please feel free to throw questions in the Q&A box, and I'll be moderating those. But while we're waiting for people to think of questions to ask, I have one myself that I'd like to pose, which is about the big tech platforms. There was some allusions to this in the presentation. I'd like to hear more about, you know, what's good, what's not good, and what could be done differently when it comes to some of the big social media platforms, especially that have really become our public sphere. And I know that there's a lot of interesting findings and recommendations about this. So for either of you, do you have something you'd like to share about that?
Nicola, go first, please.
Yeah, I think many of our interviewees had a worse experience using X, formerly Twitter, following the changes to the platform at the end of 2022, and that was the removal of the API access and the removal of a lot of the trust and safety team that was responsible for ensuring trust and safety and moderation across multiple languages. So that is one specific trend that we noticed. And as well, I think another key step in the right direction is the Digital Services Act reporting on the number of moderators that moderate platforms in each language, but that even is only with the official languages of the EU. So they don't report the number of moderators who speak Arabic, for example. And the US doesn't even have a DSA. So that is another thing that I think this proactive reporting could help to encourage more resources across languages and contexts. Noura, feel free to add.
Yeah, so I would add to what Nicola mentioned. Some, I think, concerns were raised by the participants, as we always learn from them. The most important thing is the security and encryption by design, as all of them, they have these concerns, how to maybe make the triage between safe platforms, safe, secure platforms to communicate, but they are not publicly shared or used by the participants in their home country. Or even some certain secure platforms are very dangerous to be installed on the activist devices in the home country. For instance, we can mention to the how activists who found the authorities found Signal on their devices, or even other secure applications were prosecuted just for this. So when the security by design is the approach, I believe it's something could mitigate the risk and could also mitigate the offline and the human cost of these threats. There are so many things, including how these platforms are really collaborating with victims. One of the victims we talked to was a victim of major disinformation campaign by her country of origin. But then when she tried to reach out to several platforms, she was asked to prove that the target was state-backed attack, and the harmful content remained on these platforms for more than 10 months until it was taken down by the pressure from politicians in her country of residence. So these details about like content moderation, security by design, privacy, we cannot separate them. We cannot say that there's one recommendation is or one approach is more important than the other. Nicola has such a great example about how there is technology in place, but what's lack is the willing of these platforms to use this technology. For instance, like the deep fake on Taylor Swift was in no time taken down by X and other platforms. So they can do it, but when they do it, also like it's proof that they can do these things when they want, but the how to bridge the gap and how to make these platforms and the actions by these platforms accessible to these vulnerable communities and not privilege enough people to have the direct contact with the CEOs maybe of these platforms.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'll just say it, X has become a cesspool of harm since Musk took over, and completely inconsistent in terms of, as you say, cracking down on some things, not others, no transparency around it and so forth. Well, I'm glad to say we have a lot of really interesting questions. I'm going to roll through as many of these as I can and hope that you can choose among you who addresses them. So the first one from Arun Sethi, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. What is the most secure way for someone on US soil to communicate with a human rights defender who lives under a foreign authoritarian regime? And I know Noura, we've spoken about this a lot and you've thought about this a lot. So over to both of you.
So what like the most publicly used platform is Signal, but again, the question is Signal safe for people in certain communities? So I would say we learn from them, we follow their preferences, and we follow what they believe is accessible and safe to them, which is a very hard job because every single case should be assisted separately. There's no universal answer to this, unfortunately.
Nicola, did you have anything to add to that?
Pretty much no. You've explained it perfectly. Different governments will have different means of cracking down on the use of different technologies, and I think the key is that we don't invest in any one application, because that could then become like Signal. If we just pour all of our US funding into Signal, it's easy for a country to just stop you at a border and see if you have Signal installed on your phone and potentially retaliate. So there's not one answer, and all technologies where possible should be private and secure by design.
Yeah. I should mention that the research that Noura and Nicola are outlining was undertaken under a research ethics protocol, and part of that protocol is designed precisely to have us as researchers consider those very questions to make sure we're not introducing harm to subjects as we go about the research. There's a related question here from Anne, actually, about how the research shows that these women use a lot of sophisticated techniques to protect themselves. She was wondering how or where do they learn how to protect their security and privacy? Is it mostly from peers? Is it from somewhere else? What was your sense of where they got the information that they got from?
I think that many of the people we interviewed said that they did have networks of people in the community and in their personal circles where they would share cybersecurity information and news and updates and threats. They also, some of them had received training from their organizations if they happen to work as a journalist or in an organization that is aware of this kind of targeting. However, not all of our interviewees had that privilege or had that kind of setup. Many people didn't at all, weren't paid for their work, and were just pursuing advocacy around a different full-time employment that wasn't related, and they didn't have the same institutional support. And I know Noura can add some to this as well.
Yeah, as Nicola said, few of them were like lucky enough to get some cybersecurity and digital security training, but it's not the case for everyone. And like building also on the interviews with like our bigger research project, the interviews with more than 100 exiled women activists. Many of them, they said that even though they attended some basic cybersecurity and digital security trainings, but these trainings often lack the gender aspects or the gender sensitivity of addressing digital threats. There are also the main complaint of so many activists about like, yeah, all trainings are the same. There's nothing advanced. All of them are just the basic information. Some of them mention how they are learning on their own, which is a very hard job. And Ron, I believe you would be so proud that some of them also mention how much they learned from Security Planner. So I believe just making the one of the recommendation maybe we can make is to make the digital security knowledge a common knowledge. I know so many digital rights organizations, some of whom we talk to, are doing their best to simplify the content and to make the information as accessible and as simple to the public as they can. But also these organizations have a lot of barriers in operating and in their own projects.
Yeah, and thanks for the shout out to Security Planner for those who are interested in following that up. It's at Consumer Reports, Security Planner. You just Google it and Consumer Union, you'll find it as a resource that was spearheaded by one of our colleagues, a staff member at the Citizen Lab, John Scott Railton. We have a question, another question here. What kinds of activities do you want regulators to pursue in addressing the problems you've identified? And which kinds of regulators, cybersecurity, consumer protection, privacy commissioners, and so forth, do you think can best play roles? And I guess that would vary by country too, but let's think about this in the context of US or Canada.
Yeah, I would say quickly, we need all of them together. Privacy commissioners might lack the tools to make also accountability and justice easy and accessible to victims. So I would say, first of all, we need the recognition to address transnational repression and digital transnational repression as a security concern to the nation. Like politicians and people in foreign affairs have a role to play in communicating and using the international organizations' tools. We need to make sure that the justice system in each country doesn't protect the perpetrators and take the stand and enable victims to seek remedies. There are absolutely the great role of the regulators in cybersecurity, privacy, and the protection of these people. We have also the need to assist these communities and targets in so many different means, including legally, emotionally, financially, and also assisting them in terms of securing their safety and their loved ones' safeties. So it's not one department or one agency's work. It's the whole government's and civil society work. And we hope that we see this comprehensive framework to assist victims.
Well, this paper should help in that effort for sure. Nicola, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Adjacent to the regulator question, the most common interaction with US government more broadly was either with the State Department or with the FBI. Many of our participants had been in contact with the FBI about their experiences, but they found that, again, there was a lack of follow-up, a lack of long-term investment in their safety and security. And also, as Noura mentioned in our presentation, a security force like the FBI is not going to be a place that many people feel comfortable going, depending on their own experience with state violence in the US and back home. So it's important that policymakers are able to involve the community in creating resources that are separate from law enforcement and security agencies as well. So that's why I'm very glad you asked that question, Chris. Thank you.
So a couple of questions getting back to the platforms here again. I think it's so vital because we're obviously talking about the digital ecosystem here, and that's mediated through these private companies. And I just said some critical remarks about X since Musk took over, but are there any platforms that are doing a good job right now as far as the research shows? Trust and safety teams most responsive? Are there differences based on where the activist is located?
I would say right off the bat, responses varied. I don't recall a single platform having a good track record across the board. And I think that participants' targets experiences varied heavily depending on their level of connections to people at the platforms or and same thing with people in the State Department, with people in the US government. If this person was well connected, well known, then they were able to make a louder noise on the platform. The platforms paid more attention to them if they knew someone in the platform. But if they didn't have the same level of connection, or if there was a smaller diaspora community, if their language was not widely spoken, they had a way more difficult time getting this kind of support. And this was across the board at all platforms. Although, again, X was definitely more frequently complained about than others. Noura, if you want to add on to that.
I just want to emphasize on the aspect of the language. Users often feel that the attacks on them, the harmful content in English, might most likely be taken down by the platforms versus other languages, and which is very concerning because not all attacks are in English or in other formal languages in the host states. So here, again, the questions about the content moderation and also the automation and the content moderation and the biases and the algorithms.
Right. So we have a question from Jamal about something that made a lot of news recently, which was the arrest of Pavel Durov and Telegram. Telegram, very controversial. A lot of misinformation that the platform is encrypted when in fact only a very small component or function of the platform is end-to-end encrypted, and that's individual chats when someone actually chooses that option. So that means that an arrest of a CEO like this by any country could potentially expose a lot of people's communication. Can you speak a bit about how that relates to the topic at hand here? In other words, a CEO of a big tech platform acting as a custodian for a platform that may be used as a means of communication by people at risk.
You know, it's very hard and it's very complicated, especially coming from the position of communicating with victims of Telegram itself, and how the campaigns targeting these women or some of these women we talked to were coordinated over Telegram in the first place, and all of the controversial issues around Telegram's lack of content moderation and the disinformation that was spread around the encryption by design in Telegram. All of these issues are really concerning, but you know, I don't know like how much the legal system in France could bear in mind the victims' voices. I would love to see more narrative and more considerations to victim voices versus the treating the victims as like, okay, there are victims, but they don't have voices in this. And I believe it's going to be good opportunity also to open the space for some sort of restorative justice, so people can talk really about the harm that caused by these platforms instead of just talking about what states and regulators and the judges believe the harm was.
Nicola, anything to add to that?
Nothing to add, perfectly said.
Okay, perfectly said. So there's a question from Cameron Ashraf, who's an expert himself in this area and has spent many years looking into these topics, and he just wonders about Wikipedia. And you know, you wouldn't think of Wikipedia as a place that could be you know, a source of harm, but obviously it could be, because people could make edits about people's profiles or bios or associations. And Cameron is saying they do have a direct intake system for human rights violations, accessible to anyone. Is this something that the respondents mentioned at all? Have you looked into Wikipedia?
Yeah, we did. Nicola and we looked at Wikipedia, but in different contexts, not for the purpose of drafting this white paper. There are certain state actors weaponize Wikipedia, actually, which is very concerning because of many reasons, including, if you can imagine, the immigration system. So many immigration agencies in many different countries, they look at the Wikipedia as a trusted source. So whatever is being said on Wikipedia, even if it was changed, so they will look at, and we talked to a few individuals who were victims of the weaponizing of Wikipedia. The immigration officers looked at the archive of the page, and they cited that as evidence against these people. The other issues about like in different languages, how Wikipedia teams respond. So one of the people we talked to, she managed to fix the misinformation on her in Wikipedia English, but Chinese, no chance. So I don't know, Nicola, do you remember back in the day when we were looking at Wikipedia? Of course, Iran, the Iranian regime is one of these actors weaponizing Wikipedia among so many others. But I can't recall much details about this. Please help my memory if I miss anything.
No, it was a long time ago. You're right. We didn't, yeah, I think you've covered most of the cases that I remember. I do think it's also super important to note how there are different narratives about a person in different languages. And sometimes that is intentional. A certain narrative will be spread in English, and a different or even opposite one will be spread in the official language of the home country of origin. And that is to just kind of create a complete siege on the person, on the target. One interviewee mentioned how she used to wear hijab, and she was targeted from both sides. Like in English, people would say, oh, she was an Islamist extremist. And in Arabic, people would say, oh, she's a Western extremist, you know, and creating this vitriol from both in the country of origin and in the country of residence just creates a complete siege on people. And it's also relevant as we see a world where we have more and more large language models that are learning different facts in different languages and will respond differently to people depending what language they have been trained on. So not a direct response to the Wikipedia question, but that was something that came up a lot.
Thank you. That's excellent. So I've got a question about I'm curious what your recommendations would be to like a small US-based business or NGO that may have on their staff people who are experiencing this type of gender-based digital transnational repression. And they can't comply with some of the, the way you nicely outlined, Nicola, all of those standards that have been devised. I know from being at the University of Toronto and part of our information security portfolio across the university, trying to implement those standards in a university environment, it was just, almost impossible. But for smaller organizations, small NGOs, different types of challenges, I'd imagine. Do you have thoughts about, say you were running a small business and you had staff that came to you and said, hey, I'm experiencing this. What type of support would you try to provide?
I think there's definitely a gap in the frameworks. I know there's been some work by NIST to create more accessible security principles that are sort of prioritized. I'm forgetting the exact name of the program, which is good. But from the perspective of an actual business, I think just general more education is needed about transnational repression, because some employers will actually face that, like, they will be contacted by threat agents kind of spreading disinformation. One of our interviewees, she and her husband were reported to their employer as being terrorists, and sometimes the employer will not have the necessary context to combat this or even understand what's going on. So I think education and awareness is a first step. Noura, please feel free to go ahead about actions for employers.
Yeah, definitely, because it's a very complicated and interconnected issue. A comprehensive response is really needed. If an organization, no matter the size of this organization, managed to develop cybersecurity framework that's accessible, easily employed, etc., and managed to secure all devices of their staff members perfectly, and then one of their staff members become the victim of DTR, without having the mentality of or understanding of the nature of these attacks, the possibility of how this attack could escalate to become offline attack, and what are the needs of these individuals being targeted, it's going to be impossible to say that there is a support system in place. Securing their devices is one response, but what about securing their well-being? What about assisting them in seeking remedies, the legal actions, maybe the other forms of support, which is, unfortunately, we did ask in our interviews the interviewees about their experiences with their employers, and it's really shocking that most of them, they didn't get enough, or they didn't get any support from their employers, who were praising their activism, who were praising their work that was in the first place that put them at risk. But then when they became the victim, the employers didn't have a strategy or policy in place to support them, neither digitally nor legally or financially or even emotionally. So what's really important is to develop this comprehensive framework to support potential victims of or potential targets of DTR. The other thing that's it's came repeatedly about what we call over policing, but how some employers really get they prefer not to hire people who might be the targets of DTR to avoid the burden and to protect their institution at all. So this over-policing, whether employed by the state or by the employers, whether news agencies, media outlets, and others, is really a concerning issue that came a lot and the interviews.
Great, thank you. What about law enforcement? Let's talk about that for a few minutes because, boy, there's some really interesting findings here. I personally, I was shocked in hearing people who had experienced these harms going to police forces and basically being told, hey, we can't do anything. And I guess it's understandable at one level, but you do have some recommendations on thoughts on things that could be different. Do you see any positive signs since digital transnational repression, I think, is more in the spotlight now? There's more attention paid to it. Can you point to any specific instances of law enforcement using best practices or models, anything like that happening?
Okay, while Nicola, yeah, please go.
Just a brief comment. I do remember some people saying they did have a positive experience with the FBI checking in on them or making recommendations for their home security, but experiences were completely inconsistent. But some people did have a positive experience with law enforcement. So,
yeah, I would say in the US context, one of the positive development that the FBI has recently announced the tip line that people who think that they might be the target of the DTR can report to. But there are so many criticism around it, including the accessibility, including people like not addressing people's trauma, especially the groups that were exposed to state repression in their home countries, or even communities who were over-policed in the United States, for example, the Black people, the Muslim communities, among so many others. Also, people have concerns when it comes to the perpetrators themselves. And they ask questions about how the law enforcement agencies and FBI would act if the perpetrator and the state actor is an ally of the United States. We know that there are some good examples and practices in the US when the jury system took few good steps towards, for instance, support the victims of the transnational repression by Saudi Arabia. But what about the other victims who don't feel comfortable or they fear speaking up because of the allyship between the US government and their home countries? Other concern, which is very crucial, and it raises a huge question about how the FBI and other agencies would assure people who are still undocumented and asylum seekers, and how like not creating another problem by trying to fix one problem. People don't feel comfortable and they didn't get enough assurance that reporting the transnational repression against them to the FBI would never affect their asylum cases, and would never, for the undocumented people, would never impact them negatively. So we have so many questions, and definitely there's a lot of trauma and concerns to be discussed between like the targeted communities and the agencies themselves.
Okay, we're getting down. This will be the last question. So I'm going to try to turn this into something a bit more hopeful in terms of where we could go from here. And picking up on a question that Ariel Barbosa asked in the Q&A about the long-term cybersecurity training processes for NGOs and civil society organizations. You talked a little bit about this, but I'm wondering from each of you, just briefly, if you could be a ruler for a day and have your wish and just say, this is the thing I'd like to see happen. I want to make it happen for that particular end. We're talking about NGOs, civil society organizations, and a really difficult problem, sustainability of security. Nicola, Noura, who wants to go first?
it's a really tough question. Yeah. I think a lot of it comes back to funding structures. When someone is funding an NGO or an activist group, like news outlet, someone wants to say, we achieved this, we funded this program. And it's not very glamorous to say, oh, we provided the cybersecurity to make that a safe endeavor. Adding that on definitely increases the cost substantially, and it's not as glamorous, but I think changes in funding structures and also, yeah, I also don't think that, yeah, sorry, I don't know. Noura can go ahead for now. Thank you.
It's very tough. But yeah, since Ariel invited us to wish, so in unicorn sunshine land, I wish to see that we reach the point that cybersecurity is every single moment and every day's security practice. All platforms are secure by design. Encryption and how people can control how they share their data is a dream. I believe working together, maybe hopefully we can make it through.
Well, and I'll just add that hopefully there'll be more Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity groups around the world that can do the type of work that they're doing. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shannon, I think, who's going to take over from me, right, Shannon?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ron. And also thank you once again to our presenters, Noura and Nicola, for a fantastic discussion. It's been a pleasure working with you both, as well as Gözde, over the last year to bring this paper to publication. And a huge thank you to our very active audience members for joining us today and sharing all of your questions with us. We really appreciate your participation. And as Nicola and Noura shared, if you want to learn more or have any additional questions about this work or Citizen Lab just in general, please do jot down their email addresses and reach out to them directly. We will have their emails listed in the chat. And we have also published the paper, the full paper to CLTC's website, which you can access by scanning this QR code to the right. And as we mentioned earlier, this work is part of CLTC's first ever call for papers for public interest cybersecurity research. This call supported research that aims to increase the body of knowledge about cybersecurity for low resource organizations that perform essential public interest work. So in addition to Citizen Lab's paper, we also supported 2 other publications which are being published this month. One paper from the University of Georgia, which is testing the use of swarm intelligence algorithms to enhance the implementation of CIS controls. We published this one last week, and you can find it on our website. And we also have another paper coming out at the end of September by Idaho National Labs, which will examine the intersection of cybersecurity and social equity in the energy sector. And they propose a new approach to grid security and data management. So keep an eye out for that. Lastly, if you haven't followed CLTC or Citizen Lab on social media, please do so on Twitter and X, as well as LinkedIn. We encourage you to do this, and here are our handles. Also, please head over to our websites where you can sign up for our respective newsletters so that you don't miss future events like this one and other research papers coming out from both of our centers. So I'll leave this slide up for a minute in case folks want to scan the QR code or jot down our websites or our handles. But just thank you again for joining us today, and take care, everyone.